Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
Coming how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Hi, welcome back to the Karma Koala podcast. And this episode, we're talking to Tanner J. Bean he's a Salt Lake City lawyer. He does religious freedom cases. And we're going to talk about the raid on the psychedelic church that goes by the name of Singularism. And Tanner, I'm sure, can give me a bit more detail about their name and what they're about. Basically, they were raided a while back, and he has taken up their case. And basically, I'll let him tell the story. Tanner, thank you very much for getting in touch with us. What led you to the case?
Yeah, I have been interested in religious freedom for all sorts of faiths or people of no faith, even for a long time, and have been involved through different organizations, research, organizing conferences, etc. I'm predominantly actually a labor and employment lawyer working with businesses to structure their policies and procedures and do a lot of discrimination work in that context.
Well, you're going to be busy over the next few years then, aren't you?
That's probably likely, yes. But yeah, I've always stayed in touch with the religious freedom side of things because it's been so interesting. And I came to this case by virtue of that, by keeping up to date on the religious freedom issues, especially as those things relate to LGBT non-discrimination issues in the United States. And the client here, Singularism, this religious organization, found me through that and kind of tested me out to see if I would defend their religious freedom just like I would defend my own. And we came to an agreement that it was a good fit for us, and it's been a great opportunity to represent them since then.
So, I mean, if we reel back, they were raided, and when was that, and for what reason?
What I actually like to start with is even about a year before that. Singularism strives to be very transparent and work with government officials, and sent a letter to the local government offices saying, hello, we're opening our doors here to our spiritual center. This is who we are. We'd love you to come take a tour, and invited those officials, into this space to learn more about them and their practices. Unfortunately, the government did not take them up on that offer. And so in November 2024, like you referenced, the government suddenly appeared at their spiritual
And
center.
when you say the government, state, local, federal?
This is local, and that's actually a pretty important part of our case. So this is a local city and a local county operating under state law.
So they turned up and they said what?
They essentially presented with a search warrant saying, we have information, we've done an undercover investigation, we've posed as someone who was pretending essentially to be someone who wanted to be part of the faith, and so got a little bit of information about it. And based upon that information, we understand that you have psilocybin and are distributing it and are using it in the facility. And so they came in over the course of about 2 hours, lots of interrogation, lots of looking through everything, seized the sacramental psilocybin for my client Singularism, as well as many of its religious records, which they revere to be scripture for their faith members and then just generally for the faith in whole, and then took that all back and left with a kind of a threatening message that while they did not arrest, the founder of the religion who was present, they told him that he should expect criminal charges. And then the very next day, the same sorts of organizations, the same law enforcement organization, I should say, showed up at Singularism's landlord with a letter saying that if you do not evict these individuals, this organization, we will require you to evict them, and we may even charge the costs of that sort of eviction lawsuit to you. So a lot of threats really quickly within a 24-hour period where they had been operating with no problem, no incident, no, threats from the government for
And did
over a
those
year.
authorities say how they came across the church and why they raided it at that particular time a year later? I mean, how Yeah, they are. Did they just see that there was a psychedelic church and that's why they sent some guy in undercover because they knew basically they're easy target? I mean, is that how they approached it?
Law enforcement has not said why they chose that date, or why they waited so long, over a year, with after having had received notice, from Singularism itself that it was operating its religious practices in public, with transparency. So there still hasn't been, a reason for that. Maybe that's something that will be uncovered as this case progresses.
What were after the going to the church, confiscating the psilocybin, and their materials, and then going to the landlord? What was the Is that when singularism came to you, or was there a period in between where they tried to negotiate with those local authorities?
So I had been working with Singularism before that raid happened. They were
Okay.
very concerned about working with the government authorities right from the very beginning. And so I had worked with them so they understood the relevant frameworks, the things that they needed to discuss with government if they were willing to talk to them. And so when these things happened, we were already in the know, understood what was needed to be done, and were able to file suit within a week of the raid.
So you filed suit. What happened next?
Well, if you're likely familiar with how the American system works, typically in a lawsuit, you don't get what you're asking for as a plaintiff until 2 or 3 years down the road. Unless there is a true emergency where if you didn't receive that relief right at the front while the case was proceeding, you would essentially, lose all your rights. And violations of constitutional rights are clear examples of that, and we can't pause, we can't wait for 2 or 3 years while constitutional rights are being trampled for a case to proceed. So we had to move for emergency relief, asking the court to step in and give us the relief while the case continues. And that's what's been at issue for the past few months. So there's a really quick proceeding called a temporary restraining order proceeding, where the judge hears some evidence and makes a little bit of a quicker judgment. And then there's a more full out proceeding for a preliminary injunction, basically the order that will allow things to stay protected while the case proceeds. And so we've been through both of those two stages of the lawsuit here, and Singularism has won at both stages. The federal court judge has determined that Singularism is substantially likely to win the case outright when the case goes through everything. That's actually the standard that she's determining these things under, is substantially likely to prevail upon the merits of the action. And so she ruled in December of 2024 that defendants needed to return the psilocybin and the scripture. They promptly did return the scripture, but declined to return the psilocybin and asked the judge to wait on that decision until she got to the second stage. And then in February, she issued a much longer opinion explaining her analysis in a lot more detail. And in that decision, she did order the return of the psilocybin, as well as all the other items that were confiscated during the raid. And then she also put in place an order that defendants cannot interfere with the religious practices of singularism while this case proceeds through the rest of the court.
So that's allowing the church to do its normal practices for the period of the case. What
Right.
what what happens next? I mean, what's the process? Because this is happening all over the country, isn't it? I mean, most lawyers that I've spoken to over the last few months seem to be involved in freedom of religion cases when it comes to psilocybin, which I presume is the way to open the door to allow other practices. Is that the case in Utah?
Utah is interesting. Just in 2024, in Utah's legislative session, it passed two bills which are very critical and even pertinent to Singularism's lawsuit. And the first is Utah's Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which lots of folks, acronymize into RFRA.
Hmm.
And that essentially provides the highest constitutional standard for evaluation of religious practices claims in the United States. And that was an important thing to have in Utah, because it's kind of a patchwork of protections throughout the United States as far as religious freedom goes. And it has been made so since about 1993 because the US Supreme Court changed its analysis of how the First Amendment to the Constitution works. And so, whereas before it was very protective, after that it became very not protective for religious individuals and organizations, such that Congress actually stepped in a few years after that. And that may actually have been in 93, not in this decision itself. But Congress stepped in and passed an act basically restoring the previous interpretation of the First Amendment, hence the name Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Unfortunately, that was held by the US Supreme Court just a few years after to only apply when federal actors were involved, not state or local actors. And so we began a wave of states passing state level versions, which provide the highest level of protection. And Utah finally followed suit in 2024. Now, interestingly, um, this was passed in the same legislative session as a psilocybin bill as well. In previous years, the Utah legislature had commissioned a legislative kind of research group to
Hmm.
go and do some work and make some findings to the legislature. And they provided that report to the legislature, favorably recommending, psilocybin treatments in the secular context. But they recommended that it be done according to the FDA's approval schedule and that it be done, in a slower fashion with a bunch of safety protocols implemented. Apparently, the Utah legislature was satisfied with that report so much that they put into place what I shortcut as the Psilocybin Act, passed as SB 266 medical amendments, which establishes a program for two of the healthcare systems in Utah to administer and create a psilocybin treatment program. The interesting thing about this is it's very discretionary. There are very few safety protocols or, implements in this law. All that has to be done is that it has to be psilocybin of the sort that the FDA is investigating for its uses. It has to be administered underneath the supervision of a healthcare system. It can't be given to anyone under 18, and it must be supported by what the healthcare, system deems to be a broad collection of scientific and medical research. So that became a pretty key portion of the lawsuit because if you are familiar with religious freedom cases, it's often about determining the presence of exemptions or inequalities in secular versus religious treatment in the
Hmm.
law.
This is interesting. I mean, I'm just going to go into this because it's a very, very complicated uh, set of issues at the moment, and because it's also nascent, it sounds as though the legislature created some rules and regulation for secular therapy use without much knowledge. Did they discuss anywhere in that legislation or the recommendations the type of people who would apply those treatments?
Interestingly, no. So the law actually does not specify like whether it has to be a certain kind of physician or a nurse practitioner or something like that. As long as it's overseen by a healthcare system, that should be a program that these healthcare systems can administer if they choose.
So, I mean, we're sort of in stage one, working towards trying to understand, say, what a state like Colorado or Oregon has done in terms of licensed psilocybin therapy providers. Does that
Right.
then leak into your case in terms of what churches can do?
It certainly does. So both schemes at issue in this case are kind of this state law scheme, which is Utah's RFRA that we described. And then there's the federal law scheme, which is the First Amendment. And I said earlier that the First Amendment usually isn't very protective anymore of religious individuals or organizations. But there have been cases at the Supreme Court which have slowly begun to chip away at that understanding. And the way they do that is by allowing some exceptions to get back to like the pre-1990
Mhm.
interpretation of the First Amendment. And usually that's when the government passes a law that is clearly targeted to aim religion or a particular religion. Or if the law just doesn't seem like it applies to everyone in equal fashion. So, like I mentioned earlier, it applies to secular groups and allows secular activities of this sort, but the same sort of similar activities it doesn't let a religious group do. Or the laws contain so many exemptions, especially of like a religious nature or a nature that's related to the issue at play, that it's not really applicable to everyone. It's vests all this discretion in the government to interpret the law in a way that means it's not really generally applicable to the public. And if you can show any of those things, usually you can get back to a place where the highest interpretation of constitutional, burdens is placed upon the government again, like it was pre-1990. So you have that concept going on in our case,
Hmm.
and the state RFRAs say we don't care if something seems targeted or whether it has lots of exemptions. You get the highest standard of review that the government has to justify in every case, right? And so that's why this case is perhaps likely to be resolved on that statute rather than going all the way through the First Amendment's analysis. It just provides a little bit shorter path to the court's analysis, but it depends on what happens in the case.
So I mean, essentially, it's a precedent case for the state. Are there other practitioners of in terms of psychedelic religion in Utah, or are, to avoid the pun,
Yeah.
singularism the only ones doing it?
Right. No, there are certainly other entheogenic religions present in Utah. One of the largest is called the Define Assembly, and they're actually run, in part by a former Utah legislator, which is just kind of an interesting tidbit. They run in certainly a different fashion than Singularism does. And to our knowledge, they haven't had any issues with law enforcement, despite operating and holding events in the same
That wouldn't.
jurisdiction.
Well, I don't think it's a sort of off key to say that if somebody's an ex-legislator, there's probably less likely to be hassled by the various authorities.
Yeah, could
So, and you're a lawyer, so you don't have to say that. I can say that. I mean, where do you think Utah is, both within the judiciary and within the legislature, in terms of these um, concepts compared to most other states in the US? So, and look, we know that states like, as I mentioned before, Colorado and Oregon have moved forward in a number of ways to formalize these things. Other states like Washington are moving in that direction. I mean, do you think that Utah is actually a leader in trying to understand how to negotiate these issues, because essentially the state exists on religious freedom, doesn't it, compared to other states in the US? I mean, there's quite a big cultural part of this conversation, isn't there?
There is. Yeah, and for listeners, Utah's a really interesting place. It's very unique, even in the religious composition of the rest of the United States, with its high concentration of Latter-day Saints, sometimes called Mormon individuals, right? And they had various religious freedom, abuses committed against them, through their pilgrimage across the
And it
American
seems to
West.
me that they've learned from their lessons, rather than saying we're in the majority now, everybody else, can't do what we do. They've actually gone the other way and seem to be a bit more open towards understanding other religious beliefs.
Yeah, I would say that's quite true in most instances, and our lawsuit probably be an exception from that general rule. And that may just be a feature of, the local government's persuasions there. But there's a really interesting history, and the judge in our case who issued the preliminary injunction order kind of makes reference to that, saying that it's almost ironic, that with that history, right, and with unanimous passage of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that there would suddenly be such a vigorous opposition to singularism, who was practicing in a way that really affects no public issue, no public safety, distribution of drugs, anything like that, or any significant risks.
So here's another question. In a lot of jurisdictions, especially overseas, it's legal to take medical cannabis, but it's illegal to buy seeds or seedlings. What about the sourcing of the sacrament, in terms of, and the word here is psilocybin? How does that operate? Does that operate under existing Utah law for any sacrament? Doesn't matter how you source it, or what's the issue in there? And can that will the government, the authorities in this case, be using that as an argument as to why what Singularism are doing isn't legal?
That's a great question. Utah is interesting in that it's a pretty red conservative state, but several years back did adopt medical cannabis usage, and so that's pervasive throughout the state. Um, as far as obtaining psilocybin sourcing wise, that is certainly a question that defendants have raised, and they've tried to raise it with kind of this issue of safety. Like, if we don't know where it comes from, how can we determine it's safe for our residents or people that are participating in singularism ceremonies? However, interestingly enough, the Psilocybin Act that I talked about, enabling healthcare systems to provide their own programs, also does not have any requirements or does not explain how those organizations are going to source their psilocybin in a way that would not be in contravention of Utah's Controlled Substances Act. So it's an interesting question. It's one that's probably still under development, but it certainly, bears understanding for the court. I would hope that, if there's a standard to be applied here of illegality and sourcing, it applies an equal measure to the secular conduct that the legislature has authorized.
So, how long is this process going to take? And by the sound of it, the outcome seems to be in favor. I mean, you're the lawyer, so you're not going to say this, but in favor of the plaintiff. I mean, it all seems pretty obvious, bar a few little ifs and buts, that the authorities will at some point, if they don't want to withdraw, then they're going to lose in this game in Utah. And what does that mean for religious freedom for these specific psychedelic churches, but also does that open the door for, I mean, I don't know, do marijuana or cannabis churches exist in the state? I mean, I know of some in California. They've never really been able to be as successful in religious practice as psychedelic churches, and I've never really understood that issue.
Yeah, so this could very well be a long process. It could be a 2, 3 year process depending on how things develop. We are in the unusual place where the judge has actually told us the likelihood of us to succeed. You almost never know that in a case unless you take those emergency measures that I mentioned earlier. So she told Singularism that they are substantially likely to prevail on the merits of the case. So that's certainly a message to defendants. It doesn't seem like one that they're satisfied with at this point. So it's very possible that this case, because of its uniqueness, could be involved in an appeal that would go to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals federal system, seated in Denver. And then that could return, and there might need to be more proceedings. There'll be discovery, there'll be depositions. I'm certain there will be additional motions, and then eventually some sort of a trial would need to be held. But all that will happen. Hopefully, it could be resolved more quickly. Certainly, the parties could settle at any time, which would, in many respects, probably be the best outcome to allow the religious practice to continue as expeditiously as possible.
Now, I was recommended to speak to you by Philip Dract, who practices mainly in psychedelics law. So, just to sort of wrap up and away from the case, has this introduced you to lawyers, a wider range of lawyers who deal in psychedelics issues, and given you a wider understanding of how these issues are developing around the country?
Certainly, yeah, I've had some opportunities to connect with a lot more legal professionals who are interested in this space. I predominantly run in labor and employment and religious freedom circles, but it is just another sign to me, that faith is different in every form. And in America, we have made a pledge through the First Amendment and other statutes and regulations that we must apply our religious freedom tests equally if they're really to mean anything, right? And that's something I said to Singularism at the outgate, is that, if religious freedom means anything, it has to be as beneficial to you as it is to me, even though we don't share the same sort of spiritual convictions, right? That's true religious freedom right there. And so, the more we can build that up for individuals of any religion, especially minority faiths who don't have as much power to punch at the legislature, the more beneficial it's going to be for every religious individual, whether they fall into majority camp in one state or another, or if they are religious minorities, or if they're even following their own path along a spiritual journey.
Before we go, because you are an employment lawyer and because there is a medical marijuana in Utah, have you come across any issues that are of interest in terms of how employment and these substances are working? Because obviously employment and psychedelics isn't really an issue as yet, but I mean, if this case goes through and other cases around the country, the same will apply to psychedelics and employment law as it already applies to cannabis and employment law. I mean, how far down the line is Utah with medical cannabis and employment law issues? Do they have do patients have good protections with employment law?
Yeah, it's interesting. Utah's kind of medical marijuana act and how it's manifested throughout the Utah code is kind of split up between the private employer and the public employer distinctions. So for public and public employment, medical cannabis usage in most cases is actually protected class status. So government is prohibited from discriminating against an individual using medical marijuana for, the accepted reasons, unless they're in like a safety sensitive
Well, I was about to say,
position.
unless I mean, New Jersey seems to be the big state for dealing with these problems, and
Yeah.
emergency workers, etc., etc. Yes.
Right, right, right. And so those are generally, the exceptions to that non-discrimination rule in public and employment. However, in private employment, the same rules don't apply. It's not a protected class status for private employment, so they can go about choosing to discriminate. I mean, is the word kind of selecting between one or the other, right? On the basis
And
of
and has
cannabis.
that been an issue over the past few years?
It can be. I'm not aware of any cases where it's raised at like a constitutional level of that being unjust, the public-private division. But it could be, certainly it's something that I get, some employers are perfectly happy with and they just want to have a policy for cannabis usage in the workplace, even if they're private employers. And some private employers are like, absolutely not. And they don't even have any safety sensitive positions, but they're just take hard lines about usage in the workplace still. And then, of course, I have public employers ask me frequently, well, how does this shake down for me and for this particular position? Because it gets a lot more nuanced there.
I mean, look, it's interesting because Utah isn't normally a state where the words cannabis and psychedelics sort of roll off the tongue. It's sort of
Right.
ignored, but it seems to me that as much as you can say a state has taken a sensible approach, the state has, although because it's conservative in nature, things move fairly slowly. Where do you feel that Utah sits amongst the rest of the US? Look, I write on this stuff every day. I think I can probably mention 3 or 4 times in 10 years that I've done a story on Utah with regard to either cannabis, adult use or medical, or this it's psychedelics. And this was brought to my attention rather than me finding out about it. I mean, is it a quiet get on with it state? And in a way, that's probably one of the better approaches to take to these issues, isn't it?
Yeah, I think Utah is a really interesting state as terms of politics. Obviously, it does get cast as a red state and it does poll that way, certainly. But because of the uniqueness with a lot of the Latter-day Saint population and kind of the entrepreneurial spirit, in Utah, we do see a lot of like sensitive approaches. I mean, Utah in 2015 was the first state to come out passing a law that protected LGBT non-discrimination and religious liberty in the same piece of legislation. And very few